Sarah had always believed in the quiet beauty of simple things: a steaming cup of tea at sunrise, a handwritten note tucked into her lunchbox, a soft breeze fluttering through white curtains. Life with Zion was never extravagant, but it was filled with warmth. He made her laugh like no one else could, and even during tough times, he'd pull her close and say, "One day, all of this will be behind us." They lived in a rented two-bedroom apartment in a lively but humble neighborhood. The walls carried the scent of cooked spices and old books, and though the paint was peeling in corners, it never bothered them. Love lived in that home, in the late-night board game matches, the dancing in the kitchen, and the way he used to kiss her forehead after dinner. Zion was a man of vision. He read books about entrepreneurs, idolized billionaires, and would often sketch out business ideas in a worn notebook he kept on the bedside table. Sarah admired his ambition. She'd hold his hand, listen to his ideas, even the wild ones, and support him without question. They had promised each other that they'd build a future hand in hand, no matter how long the road. When she found out she was pregnant, she couldn't contain her joy. Her hands trembled as she held the positive test. She imagined Zion lifting her in his arms, whispering that their dreams were coming true. But the celebration never came. When she told him the news, his expression didn't mirror her excitement. He smiled faintly, nodded, and said something vague about needing time to process. The warmth in his voice had dimmed. In the days that followed, Sarah began noticing the changes. Zion stayed out later than usual. He spent more time on his laptop, networking, cold calling, pitching ideas. When they sat down to eat, his mind was elsewhere, his eyes glued to his phone. He stopped asking how she was feeling, stopped noticing when she struggled to stand up after bending to pick something. Conversations shifted. He no longer talked about their baby or about them. Instead, he spoke of investors, startups, making millions, owning penthouses, driving imported cars. "I want more than this life, Sarah," he told her one night, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. Sarah felt a chill creep through her chest. Their shared dreams now seemed to be unraveling into his individual ambitions. And though she still held on to hope, a quiet ache had begun to settle in her heart, the kind that knew something precious was slowly slipping away. It happened on a Tuesday evening, just after dinner. The kitchen still smelled of lentils and garlic naan. Sarah was wiping down the table when Zion stood near the living room doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, his face unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. She looked up, half smiling, thinking he might finally be ready to reconnect. But what followed shattered her world. "I'm leaving, Sarah." The words didn't make sense at first. She stared at him, expecting a laugh or an explanation. But his face remained stone cold. "Leaving where?" she asked softly. Zion sighed, pacing slowly as if preparing for a speech. "I can't do this anymore. I need space, space to grow, space to breathe. I can't be tied down with a baby right now." Sarah blinked rapidly, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you saying?" "We're having a baby, Zion. Our baby. This isn't just a phase." His expression hardened. "That's exactly it. You don't get it. I want more from life. I have big dreams, and I can't carry all this weight, this marriage, this responsibility." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "So I'm a burden now? The baby is a burden." Her voice cracked. She stepped closer, clutching her belly as if to shield the child from his words. "Zion, we can work this out. We always do. Please don't do this. Not now." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into the drawer near the television and pulled out a thin file. He dropped it onto the table. "Divorce papers." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You planned this." Zion looked away. "I met someone else." The words sliced through her like a blade. He continued, almost clinically, "She understands where I'm headed. Her father is investing in my startup. I can't let this chance go. Not for anything." It wasn't just betrayal, it was business. Sarah couldn't believe the man standing in front of her was the same one who once wrote poetry on napkins for her. The same man who once promised he'd never leave her side, no matter how poor they stayed. Now he was trading her in for connections and capital. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, clutching her stomach as though holding on to the only piece of love she had left. But Zion didn't comfort her. He didn't flinch. Instead, he walked to the door and said, "You'll need to leave by the weekend. I've already made arrangements." The words echoed in her ears long after he left the room. That night, she packed slowly, silent, in shock. Just a few clothes, a small toiletry bag, and a framed ultrasound photo. That was all she took. As she stepped out of what used to be her home, she didn't know where she was going. Only that the man she loved was gone, and she was now homeless, heartbroken, and pregnant. The city had never looked this cold before. Tall buildings that once seemed full of opportunity now loomed over Sarah like silent judges, their glowing windows mocking her from above. Every street corner, every honking car, every rushing pedestrian reminded her how invisible she had become. Pregnant and alone, she walked with a heavy bag in one hand and a growing weight inside her womb. Her back ached. Her ankles swelled. But there was no place to rest. No door to knock on. No hand waiting to hold hers. In the beginning, she reached out to a few friends, but their responses were all the same, pity laced with hesitation. "I'm so sorry, Yar. I wish I could help, but things are complicated right now." Some didn't respond at all. Her relatives had long cut ties after she married Zion without their blessing. And now that he was gone, so was her place in anyone's life. She became a ghost in a city that never looked back. Hunger came first. A deep, gnawing emptiness that made her dizzy by noon each day. She nibbled on cheap biscuits and drank water from public taps. Once, she found half a sandwich on a bench and, swallowing her pride, devoured it in seconds. Her body began to feel weak. Some nights, she curled up near the back of a mosque, pretending to be asleep so no one would bother her. Other nights, she wandered aimlessly, too scared to stop, her eyes wide in fear of drunkards or thieves. Strangers glanced at her with suspicion. A few muttered cruel things under their breath. "Another drama girl," one man scoffed as he saw her begging for spare change. Probably faking it for sympathy. The judgment was worse than the hunger. She pulled her dupatta tighter around her belly, trying to hide her pregnancy from prying eyes. But the truth was in her slow walk, in the pain etched across her face, in the way she paused every few steps to catch her breath. One particularly cold evening, as rain started to drizzle and the wind pierced through her thin shawl, Sarah sat down under a bridge, hugging her knees. She tried not to cry, but the tears came anyway, hot and bitter. Her entire body trembled, not just from the cold but from despair. It was then that she heard the soft creak of a trolley. An old woman, bent with age but alert-eyed, walked by, pulling a cart of discarded clothes and tea flasks. She paused and looked at Sarah. "Beta," she said gently, "you shouldn't be out here in your condition." Sarah looked up, ashamed but too tired to respond. The woman, who introduced herself as Roxana, didn't ask many questions. She poured some tea into a chipped cup and handed it to Sarah. Then she pulled a faded woolen blanket from her trolley and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Stay warm tonight. There's a corner near the mosque wall, less wind there. I'll walk you." Sarah could barely hold her cup, her fingers stiff with cold. But the warmth of the tea and the blanket brought more than just physical relief. It stirred something inside her that had gone quiet for days. Hope. Someone had seen her. Someone had helped without asking why. As she lay against the wall later that night, wrapped in Roxana's blanket, with the faint scent of cardamom lingering in the air, she whispered to her unborn child, "We're still here. We're still breathing. And somehow, we'll make it." The women's shelter smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt chai, with whispers echoing through narrow hallways. It wasn't home, but it was warm, safe, and quiet, luxuries Sarah had come to treasure. She'd been staying there for just over a week now, slowly recovering from the weeks spent on the street. Her body still ached, but at least she had a mattress to sleep on, a warm meal in her stomach, and nurses who checked on her every morning. That afternoon, Sarah sat curled up on a tattered sofa in the common room. A few other women sat nearby, some crocheting, others silently flipping through old magazines. A small television hung crookedly on the wall, its volume turned low. The news anchor's voice was steady, professional, emotionless. Just background noise, until a name pierced through the static. Zayan Malik, the young entrepreneur from Karachi, made headlines today as he officially launched his tech startup Zenex, after receiving a 7-figure investment. Sarah's head snapped toward the screen. The image froze her in place. There he was, Zayan. Her Zayan. Wearing an expensive suit, his hair gelled perfectly, a confident smirk on his face as he shook hands with suited men and smiled beside flashing lights. He looked like he had walked out of a glossy magazine cover. He wasn't just doing well, he was thriving. The camera panned to a woman beside him, tall, elegant, with flawless makeup and a diamond ring that glinted under the camera lights. His wife, Misha Qureshi, daughter of renowned investor Fahim Qureshi, accompanied him at the launch event, the anchor continued. Wife. Sarah felt her breath leave her lungs. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly. Her child, their child, rested quietly inside her, unaware of the storm raging outside. Her eyes stung with hot tears, but she couldn't look away. On the screen, Zayan was laughing, charming and confident. Cameras loved him. The crowd adored him. There wasn't a single flicker of guilt, not a shadow of doubt in his eyes. It was as if Sarah had never existed. As if their love story, their marriage, and her pregnancy had all been erased and replaced by something shinier, wealthier, more worthy of attention. She whispered softly, as if her child could hear her. That man is your father. The weight of those words sank heavily into the room. Her shoulders trembled as the realization grew darker. Not only had he left her, but he had never once looked back. No calls. No messages. No guilt. Just success, cameras, and another woman beside him. Sarah turned her face away from the screen, clutching her belly with both hands. We don't need him, she whispered through tears. We never did. But deep down, the betrayal twisted deeper. Not because he had moved on, but because he had replaced her without a second thought. Like she was nothing. And now, he was a millionaire. And she was still sharing a blanket with strangers in a shelter. The monsoon hit the city hard that week, flooding the streets and soaking everything in sight. Rainwater leaked through the shelter's aging roof, dripping steadily onto the tiled floor. Sarah had been feeling weak for days, but that morning, she couldn't even sit up. A wave of dizziness overtook her, and the pain in her lower back and abdomen became unbearable. She collapsed just outside the bathroom, and within minutes, shelter staff were rushing her to the nearest government hospital. The hospital was overcrowded and noisy, filled with patients coughing, crying, waiting endlessly. Sarah lay on a rusted stretcher, burning with fever, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her clothes were damp from the rain, her skin pale. A young nurse named Anila noticed her immediately. Something about the sadness in Sarah's eyes, the way she held her belly protectively even in pain, struck her deeply. As doctors examined Sarah and started 4 fluids, Anila noticed a small, worn diary peeking out of her cloth bag. Out of concern, she flipped it open to check for emergency contacts, but instead found pages filled with raw, emotional writing. Sarah's handwriting was neat but shaky, and the words bled with pain. I was never supposed to end up here. He left me the same week I told him about our baby. I still remember how his eyes used to light up when he made chai for both of us. Now those eyes look at someone else. Anila closed the diary slowly, heart aching. She looked at Sarah, fragile and silent in the hospital bed, and knew she had to do something more. That night, she called her university friend Manur, now a reporter for an online news agency. You need to hear this story, Anila said quietly over the phone. You won't believe who left her. With Sarah's permission, once she regained some strength, Manur spent the next few days at the hospital. She read through the diary with care, asked gentle questions, and took notes with trembling fingers. The article she wrote was unlike any she had ever published. Homeless and pregnant, abandoned by Pakistan's rising star. Within hours of going live, the story exploded across social media. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram flooded with shares, comments, and reactions. Hashtags like #JusticeForSarah and #ShameOnZion trended across the country. Thousands were shocked to read the truth behind the man they once admired. How can a millionaire abandon his pregnant wife and pretend she never existed? One comment read. Another simply said, "This is every woman's worst nightmare." Donations poured in. Strangers from around the world sent money, baby clothes, food, and letters of support. NGOs reached out to offer housing, legal help, medical care, and counseling. Influencers and celebrities reposted the article, calling for Zion to answer for what he had done. Talk shows wanted interviews. Activists called it a moment of reckoning. Back in the hospital, Sarah watched all this unfold with wide, astonished eyes. She had spent months being invisible. And now, her story was on everyone's screen. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Nurse Anila sat beside her, holding her hand. "You matter, Sarah. Your pain matters. And people are listening now." Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks, not from sadness, but something close to healing. She looked down at her belly and whispered, "You and we're going to be okay." The morning started like any other for Zion, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, sunlight streaming through the towering windows of his glass-walled penthouse. He scrolled through his notifications casually, expecting emails from investors, media invites, or congratulatory messages on Znex's growing success. But instead, his screen was a storm of mentions. #JusticeForSarah. #FakeMillionaire. #HeartlessZion. At first, he frowned in confusion. Then his fingers began to move faster. One headline after another filled his feed. Millionaire tech star abandoned pregnant wife, now she's homeless and fighting for her life. Zion Malik's dirty secret, behind the glamour lies a woman left to suffer. His heart began to pound, not from guilt, but from fear. His name was everywhere, but not in celebration. In shame. His assistant called within minutes. "Sir, we have reporters outside the building. They're blocking the driveway. It's all over GOARY, even BBC picked it up." Zion snapped, "Tell them to leave. This is just some emotional stunt someone cooked up." But his voice wavered as he scrolled further and saw Sarah's face in a hospital bed, pale, exhausted, yet dignified. Her diary excerpts had been published. So had details of their relationship, their sudden divorce, and the shelter she ended up in. The story had touched something deep in the public. People weren't just angry, they were furious. Brands began quietly pulling back. A major clothing company canceled a joint campaign. One of his largest investors emailed his PR team demanding a formal statement. "Our brand cannot be associated with a man accused of such cruelty," it read. That afternoon, Zion sat down with a news channel for damage control. The anchor asked direct, sharp questions. Zion smirked, composed, and replied, "This is nothing more than a cheap ploy for attention. Anyone can write a sob story and post it online. I was divorced legally. We were incompatible. She has no claim on my life anymore." He leaned back, confident the matter would fade away soon. But the next day, it got worse. Someone, an ex-employee or a friend-turned-critic, leaked the divorce papers to the press. The dates matched exactly with Sarah's story. A damning detail emerged. She had been 2 months pregnant when he filed. Public sentiment flipped fully. Even those who had remained neutral now condemned him. Online forums filled with comments, "She was carrying his child. How can a man do this?" And, "He replaced love with status. That's not success, it's cowardice." Protests erupted outside his company's launch event. Activists held signs saying, "Profit over people," and "Real men don't abandon." Investors grew colder. A few demanded accountability. Zion tried to bury it under new projects, new press releases, flashy events, but the internet doesn't forget. And now, neither would the world. The image of the smiling tech prodigy had cracked, and underneath, people had seen someone unrecognizable. The private hospital was nothing like the places Sarah had grown used to. The sheets were clean, the air smelled of lavender disinfectant instead of sweat and bleach, and the nurses smiled when they entered the room. A soft blue curtain fluttered in the window, and a tray of warm soup rested on the side table. For the first time in months, she was safe, truly safe. She couldn't believe how everything had changed so quickly. Just weeks ago, she was collapsing in the rain, cold and hopeless. Now, she had people calling her by name with warmth, volunteers checking in, and gifts arriving daily. Tiny onesies, baby blankets, letters from strangers, and donations pouring in from people she'd never met. All of it was overwhelming. Beautiful. Healing. NGOs stepped in with a fierce determination. They gave her a furnished apartment in a safe women's housing unit, complete with a crib and baby essentials. A counselor visited her weekly, helping her unpack the trauma she had buried deep for months. "You survived, Sarah," she said once. "And now, you're allowed to live." Monur, the journalist who had brought her story to light, didn't just disappear after publishing the article. She returned, often sitting by Sarah's bedside with a laptop in hand. "You have a voice, and people want to hear it," she said. "Right. Tell them how it felt. Show them what strength really looks like." Sarah, hesitant at first, started with short paragraphs. Then pages. Then full drafts. Her words, once confined to her old diary, were now being published on Monur's platform, each piece echoing across social media, reaching women like her. Then came the moment that changed her world forever. On a quiet Tuesday morning, after hours of labor, Sarah gave birth to a baby girl. Her cries filled the room like a song, raw and alive. Sarah held her to her chest, skin to skin, eyes wet with silent tears. The doctors smiled. The nurses clapped. Outside, news channels announced the birth of Pakistan's baby of hope. Hashtags trended once again. Hashtag hope is born. Hashtag Sarah strong. Hashtag light after darkness. Sarah named her daughter Asha. The child became more than just her baby. She became a symbol of resilience. Talk shows ran specials about her. Schools sent hand-drawn cards. Strangers offered to sponsor her education. And through it all, Sarah held Asha tightly, shielding her from the noise, but letting the love in. "You saved me," she whispered to her tiny daughter one night. "Without even trying. You brought me back to life." One day, an email arrived. An international women's rights organization had heard her story and wanted her to speak at their annual conference. The invite was formal, impressive, and intimidating. Sarah hesitated for days. The thought of standing on stage, of reliving the pain in front of cameras and a crowd, made her chest tighten. But something in her said yes, not for herself, but for the women still hiding, still silent, still scared. So she said yes. Dressed in a soft beige shower camise, hair tied neatly, and Asha wrapped close in a sling across her chest, Sarah took the stage weeks later. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied, like it always had when she wrote. "I thought I was forgotten. I thought I was weak. But pain does not mean you are powerless. And motherhood is not a burden, it is a beginning." The room stood in applause. Her daughter slept peacefully against her heart. And Sarah, once broken, once discarded, stood in her power, shining. The bright lights of the studio buzzed softly above, and the air held the strange tension of anticipation. The audience had gathered early, the seats filled with curious faces. Phones were tucked away, attention razor-sharp. Everyone was waiting for the confrontation that had been teased for days. Sarah and Zion, live. The promos had called it the most emotional episode of the year. Backstage, Zion adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror. He looked every bit the polished businessman, suit crisp, hair perfect, expression controlled. He believed this was his chance to reclaim the narrative, to smooth things over. Maybe even twist the sympathy back in his favor. After all, He had always been good with words. Across the hallway, Sarah sat silently with her daughter in a green room. She wore a light peach kurta, simple earrings, and no makeup beyond a touch of lip balm. Asha rested in the arms of a caretaker nearby. Sarah breathed in slowly, her palms pressed to her knees. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. When the host introduced them and they both stepped onto the stage, the room held its breath. Zion walked out confidently. Sarah followed, calm and poised, her gaze steady but not harsh. They didn't look at each other. The host, a seasoned journalist known for sharp interviews, began by asking Zion about the timeline. He gave rehearsed answers, cool, detached, as if everything had been a necessary sacrifice for ambition. He called the viral story exaggerated and emotional manipulation. But when it was Sarah's turn, she didn't defend herself. She didn't attack. Her voice was soft, but each word landed like truth laid bare. I never wanted to ruin your life, Zion, she said, eyes forward. I just wanted you to care. To look at me, at your child, and not turn away like we never existed. The audience was silent. Zion shifted in his seat. It's not that simple. We both made choices. No, Sarah interrupted gently. You made a choice. I made a promise. And I kept it, even when I had nothing left. Then the host turned the tide. Zion, before the show, we received confirmation of some concerning information. Your offshore accounts and undeclared funding have been exposed by a whistleblower. Care to explain? Zion froze. The cameras zoomed in as his confident mask began to slip. He stammered. Denied. Deflected. The host pressed on. Screens behind them flashed documents, emails, proof. The audience, once silent, began to murmur. Then they began to clap, for Sarah. As the show ended, Zion looked smaller, cornered, and alone on the stage where he had expected applause. Meanwhile, Sarah stood tall, shaking the host's hand. People stood to cheer her. Some had tears in their eyes. She didn't smile out of pride, only relief. In that moment, the world saw what power truly looked like. Not money, not fame, but the unshakable dignity of a woman who refused to stay broken. Months passed, and the world around Sarah shifted in ways she had never imagined. What began as survival became something greater. Purpose. Her story, once confined to the pages of a tattered diary, now lived in books, documentaries, and voices across the globe. A small publisher approached her after the talk show aired, and with Manor's encouragement, Sarah poured her truth into a memoir. It was raw, emotional, and unapologetically honest. The title? Hope Carried Me. The book became a bestseller within weeks. Readers resonated with every word. Women from every walk of life wrote to her, sharing their own hidden pain, their strength, their journeys. Sarah's story had become more than news, it had become a mirror for countless others. She began receiving invitations to speak, not just locally, but internationally. She stepped onto stages in modest clothing, sometimes carrying Asha in her arms, sometimes holding her hand as the child toddled by her side. Audiences hung on to every word. Not because she spoke like a politician or a performer, but because she spoke from a place they recognized, the edge between despair and survival. With the support of NGOs and donors, Sarah launched a foundation, the Asha Project, named after her daughter. Its mission was simple: to provide shelter, counseling, and job training for abandoned women and single mothers. She visited the shelter often, listening to their stories, holding their hands, reminding them, this isn't the end of your story. Meanwhile, Zion's empire was crumbling under the weight of his own lies. The fraud investigations uncovered years of financial manipulation, offshore scams, and backdoor dealings. Investors pulled out. His accounts were frozen. His company shut down under government order. His lavish penthouse was auctioned off. Misha, his trophy wife, left without a word, vanishing as swiftly as she had appeared. The media that once praised him now mocked his downfall. But Sarah didn't react. She didn't post about it. She didn't celebrate. She had long since stopped looking back. When asked about Zion in an interview, she paused, then smiled gently. "I wish him peace," she said. "But I don't carry him anymore. My arms are full with something better." The interviewer leaned in. "What gave you the strength to keep going?" Sarah looked down at Asha, now crawling across the studio floor, giggling at her reflection on the polished tiles. Her eyes softened. "My daughter saved me," she said quietly. "Without ever knowing how broken I was, she made me whole again. She gave my pain a purpose." The interviewer blinked, momentarily speechless. Sarah continued, her voice steady. "I thought I needed someone to stand beside me to be strong. But the truth is, I just needed to believe I was worth saving." And now, she lived that belief every day, not just for herself, but for every woman still waiting to rise. The house was modest but beautiful, painted in soft earth tones, with flowering plants blooming outside the windows and wind chimes tinkling gently in the breeze. Sarah walked slowly through the hallway, her fingers brushing against the family photos that lined the walls. One of them showed her holding a newborn Asha, wrapped in a pink blanket. Another, taken just months ago, captured them both smiling at a book launch event, Asha in a blue dress, proudly standing beside her mother. It was a home built not of bricks alone, but of survival, dignity, and quiet triumph. Every corner held a memory, a lesson, a piece of the journey they had taken together. "Mama!" Asha's voice rang out like music. She came running down the hallway, her ponytail bouncing as she waved a folded piece of colored paper in her hand. "Look what I made at school." Sarah knelt to catch her, laughing as her daughter threw her arms around her neck. Asha opened the paper and pointed to a crayon drawing. Two stick figures, one taller and one smaller, holding hands beneath the sun. At the top, in careful handwriting, it read, "My mom is my hero." Tears prickled at the corners of Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away and smiled. "This is the best thing I've ever seen," she whispered, pressing a kiss to Asha's forehead. They sat down to dinner shortly after, dal chawal, roti, and a simple cucumber salad. Nothing extravagant, but it filled the home with comfort. They talked about school, books, and the upcoming community festival where Sarah had been invited to speak again. Asha listened with wide-eyed wonder, as if her mother were the bravest woman in the world. The television played softly in the background, the sound muted. As Sarah poured a second helping of rice, a familiar face flashed on the screen. Zion, now older, dressed in a plain black suit, standing in a courtroom beside his lawyer. The banner at the bottom read, "Final hearing in Zenek's fraud trial." Sarah noticed it but didn't flinch. There was no bitterness in her chest, no spark of anger. Just a passing recognition of someone she once knew. She picked up the remote and quietly turned the TV off. That chapter was closed. Later that night, after Asha had brushed her teeth and chosen a bedtime story, Sarah tucked her into bed beneath her favorite pink blanket. Asha yawned and curled up close, her little hands clutching her school project under the pillow. Sarah leaned down and kissed her cheek, then whispered softly, "We're home now. And no one can take that away." She turned off the light and stood at the doorway for a moment, looking at her daughter's peaceful silhouette. The world outside would continue spinning, noisy, unpredictable, and often cruel, but inside these walls, peace had finally arrived. And Sarah, once left with nothing, now had everything she ever needed.